This morning, we've got this is a tough one. It's a tough one, not in the sense that it is difficult to talk about, but in many ways, our topic this morning has to do with almost the totality of everything we've been talking about in this entire series. So the series, we've been really focusing on this concept of asking ourselves deep questions about what we think, what we believe, what we practice, what we value. And to stop and ask ourselves these things, to put it before God. But every one of those assumes that you even care what God has to say. I mean, it assumes that at some point, if God has an opinion on something, that you are interested in that opinion. And I don't know that that's always an assumption we can make. In many ways, here's the scenario that I often hear. Somebody will come up and they'll be really struggling deeply with their faith. And usually what that means, when I hear people say they struggle with their faith, the scenario I usually get is, Bill, I don't understand. I've been praying and I'm praying and I'm praying and I'm still having this life. No matter how much I try, I do all the right things. I go to church and I read my Bible and I do these things, and yet still I haven't received, I haven't attained, whatever it is. I don't like the life I live. I don't like where I am economically. I don't like the fact that I don't have the spouse that I was hoping to have, that I don't have the success that I was meaning to have. And I've got to come over here and grab my nifty little thing that I forgot to turn on. Let's see, I'm supposed to preach for half an hour. We'll start that now. Amen. That what we have is this concept over and over that people live a Christian life, but they don't have an idea really what that means. I mean, they have some concept, and maybe a better way to put it is they do have an idea of what it means, but it doesn't necessarily agree with anybody else's idea. And it doesn't necessarily agree with Scripture's idea that we really compartmentalize our faith. That we say, well, okay, these are the things that it takes to follow God, and here's my nifty little list, and as long as I get those done, then I fit the definition. And I should have these benefits as a result. And I am fascinated, though, by a G.K. Chesterton quote, where he mentions just the opposite. He goes, really, when we talk about how hard it is to be a Christian, when we really talk about what it takes to be a person of faith, it's not really that the Christian ideal has been tried and found wanting. It's not really the sense that we've tried it and it didn't work. He says the thing is that the Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried. That often we just don't take that nth step because it's really hard. And the reason this quote works, I think it works for absolutely every one of us. There are those of us who have yet to accept Christ, and I think in many ways that can certainly work. But for those of us who have been followers of Jesus, that can describe us too. That there are parts of our lives that we are yet learning, that we have yet to give over to God. That kind of makes sense to me. I mean, at least in my experience, my journey of faith is one of incremental movement towards a greater sense of giving my life over to God. I mean, it could come from just the intellectual questions I have. See, some people get the sense that if I hit some level of Christian faith, then I won't have questions anymore, and that isn't accurate for any person of faith I know. Now, the questions change. I mean, early on in my faith, I'd be asking questions like, how do I really know? And is there really a God? And what is he really like? And while I began to ask those questions, as I've gotten farther and farther in my faith and felt comfortable with those questions and those answers, they're new questions. And I figure no matter where I get in my faith, there's always going to be questions. The question, like one of the questions I struggle with now, I know I'm a pastor, I'm not supposed to mention those. Like I wonder deeply what it means to try to follow the Prince of Peace in a war-torn world. I mean, what does that even look like? I mean, when it makes so much sense to do almost exactly the opposite of what Jesus tells us to. How do I live that out? I don't know. That's really hard. There always seem to be questions, and it's not just questions intellectually. There are parts of learning to trust God in new ways that goes incrementally. I remember that I really felt like I got to a place of saying, God, my life is yours. And I mean that literally. If I were to die tomorrow, because I really always knew I would die before I hit 20 and it'd be run over by a New York City taxi cab. And I was okay. I was like, God, whatever you want to do, my life is yours. Well, that became harder when I got married. And it's like, okay, but can I really trust you with my wife's life? I mean, I need to protect her and I don't know if I can trust you, God, with her. And that question even became even harder when I had children. Like, really, what does that even mean? And those new levels of trust, and there's always this greater degree of learning to give it over to God. And I submit that our entire faith journey, the reason this quote works is because every one of us, no matter where we are on our journey of faith, we have yet to be able to give everything over to God. And yet that's exactly what we're expected to do. Notice how the Bible puts it in Romans 12. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. That is your true and proper worship. In view of God's mercy, brothers and sisters, offer your bodies. Now, there's a reason that Paul, when writing Romans, would use the term bodies. Because in the ancient world, well, certainly for the Greeks and the Romans at the time, and the Jews certainly struggled with this as well. But there were, for the most part, they believed in the separation of body and soul so much that body didn't matter. Whatever you do with your body doesn't matter because it's really all about your soul. And your body, it just does whatever you're going to do with it. There's the issue of what you should and could do with it aren't even material. What really matters is deep within your psyche and your soul. When Plato writes about what it means to really be just, he talks about the inner life only. He talks about what ordering your inner life and your thoughts and your soul has nothing directly to do with how you deal with your body, and which is different maybe than the Eastern world, where the Eastern world would say, in a lot of Eastern philosophy, is that your body is really an illusion. Your body in any true form doesn't actually exist. And so when Paul is writing this, and he suggests, no, the actual way you live, the way you go about living life, and the things you do day to day are directly impacted by whether or not you have a view of God's mercy. And that you indeed need to offer your everyday getting up, walking around, going to work, hanging out with people kind of life to be offered to God as a living sacrifice. Now, as almost paradoxical as that phrase is in English, living sacrifice, it's even more so in the Greek. The word sacrifice means to kill. And so it means a living kill. It is absolutely intentionally paradoxical. And the Greeks and the Romans would have understood it as much as the Jews, this idea of sacrifice, that a sacrifice is something you take and you get rid of and you kill and you put on an altar and it's gone and it does something. And so they certainly understood that. And when they hear living sacrifice, it's just as much for us, this idea of like, how can you both be living and a sacrifice? And I think to break that apart, we need to understand that this metaphor in part is not, to say it's a living sacrifice is to say it's different from a regular sacrifice in some ways. And I think one of the ways that Paul would want to be really clear about the fact that it's different is in the nature of sacrifice to begin with. You see, one of the ways a living sacrifice is different is it's not nearly as bloody. And I mean that literally, because you see, for so many, even the ancient Greeks as well as the Romans, but certainly the Jews, they had this sense that when we offered a sacrifice, it was to make up for something. It was to atone for something. So here we have the system of, I've blown it and I've done something wrong, so I'm going to give of something that I would otherwise have. I'm going to sacrifice this to somehow make some kind of justice and recompense, to make up for it. And that somehow some things will be better as a result of doing this. And that was certainly the system that even God had set up for the ancient Jews when he called these blood sacrifices. Now, he indicates later that the whole setup was to help us understand more of this concept. It was more to understand the sacrifice of Jesus and how that represents. But you've got to realize that really what he's saying, this idea of atonement, is not what we're talking about. To be a living sacrifice is in no way a suggestion that you have to give up enough so that you'll be made right with God. That if you finally, you give this part, then God will finally care for you. That he will finally love you. That he will finally call you on his team if you reach this level of sacrifice. That's not what Paul is suggesting. Because the work of Jesus Christ on the cross as the final atonement says this fundamental cosmic recognition: you can't earn your way back to God. And so God removed that from the equation. He already set up the final atoning sacrifice. That instead, that this is a sacrifice that is one that is born of response more than it is religion. And what I mean by that is the promise of religion is just that. If you do the right things, then you'll get the right life. If you do all the good stuff, you'll get the good stuff. If you go through the checklist of all the things that you need to do, and maybe you're just a spiritual person and not religious, so you have a very short list. Or maybe you'll even call yourself a religious person, you have a very long list. Whatever it is, that if you just do that minimal stuff, that will lead to the good life. And that's the promise of religion, and that is not at all what God is suggesting. That the sacrifice of living sacrifice has everything to do with being willing to respond simply out of the relationship. When I do things to care for my wife or children, I do so not because, man, I know if I do this, I'll finally get in their good graces and have the good life I want. Because trust me, it wouldn't work. But it's born more out of the fact that I already have this relationship. My sacrifices are a response to a relationship, maybe a deepening of the relationship that I desire, but it doesn't cause the relationship. It doesn't start the relationship. The other way this living sacrifice is different is in the sense that in many ways a sacrifice was something you could just do. It was an event. It was a discrete moment in time. There was a time when you hadn't sacrificed, a time when you do sacrifice, and a time after you've sacrificed. That it was this discrete moment. And so you would come up at these appropriate times to the temple or the altar or whatever, and you would do your event and you'd be done with it. And it was this one time and you could walk away, well, I did it. I did my stuff. I did the checklist. I've got it done. But a living sacrifice has to keep going. I mean, you know the old joke, right? The problem with living sacrifices is they keep crawling off the altar. And so that was what we're stuck with, that there has to become this intentional, purposeful, day in, day out, climbing back on top of that altar. To become a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. So my suggestion, the first blank in your outline, is the key to effective Christian living, the key to really living out this deep, deep reality is to become a living sacrifice. To do that, the story I'm about to tell you, I stole from a sermon I heard this week, and he stole it from another sermon he read. So I don't know how to give this proper credit. So let's just admit that I stole it, okay? I think Gershner was the pastor's name as he was preaching. And he is preaching on this very subject to what appears to be a number of young people. And he tells this story to describe the reality of what this means. And he tells of a young girl in the 1930s, 1940s, a young girl about 15 or 16 who goes to a Christian conference, and what she hears just touches her deeply. And she makes this deep commitment to Christ. Because she was touched so deeply, and she says, you know, what I just felt really called to do at that moment when I'm 15 years old, in this moment and in this Christian conference, that I will devote the rest of my life to be a lifetime of missionary service. She specifically had on her heart Asia. Now, this may be hard to imagine. I mean, you've got a picture, sure, somebody makes this commitment. But this is the 30s. This is the 40s. This some young girl doesn't just go and do this. There are so many barriers to some young girl wanting to do it. And so, plus just the impetuousness of youth. Like, we can imagine where we get really emotional and we make this commitment, and she makes this commitment. And we've all seen people who make commitments, and then when time goes on, it falters. But not her. She continues to study, to research, to look at what it would take to really live this out. Her commitment to this did not falter. And in many ways, she said in her commitment, said, God, this is not my life, this is your life. I give it completely over to you. And that comes as a result of, because as she began to research, she talked to the missionary agencies, and she found out that, there's some things she needed to do. She needed to, study. There was some cross-cultural stuff. There was some language stuff she needed to learn. She needed to learn Bible and theology, and she needed to do all these things. And as a woman in the 30s and 40s, another thing she needed to do was be married. Because they didn't send single Christian women over to be missionaries in Asia. There were some safety concerns, there were some cultural reasons, there were some bunch of stuff, and that's what they need. And so as she's preparing, she decides to go to Bible college. She decides to go there to get the training, to learn what it takes to do these kind of things. She makes this commitment, and realizing that's not going to prepare her for other avenues and paths. And she prays and she says, God, this is your life. This isn't about me. This is about what you want, and I am going to do what you want. All these preparations, I'm going to burn the ships. I've got no other direction to go. I am going to say that this is the only path, and I will walk that path, and I will devote everything to you. God, I just need one thing from you. I need a husband. So she goes to Bible college, and she learns the things, and she continues to sacrifice and make these decisions and to train. And as she goes from one year to the next, she's not dating anybody. She doesn't have a husband. She doesn't have prospects for a husband. But she continues on the path, continuing to trust that God will indeed give that to her. Until she describes that on the day before graduation, she's ready for this missionary journey. She's done all the work that she can do, but she still has no husband, has no boyfriend, has no prospects. And she describes this deep moment and anguish of prayer as an angry woman. Like, God, I've done it all. I went all the way for you. There was nothing else I could give up. I have given everything to you. I have no other path in life. I have no other choices. I went all the way. I did only this, only for you. And I only asked one thing out of you, and you didn't do it. And that's when it hit her. That despite her prayer earlier of saying that she had committed everything to God, that she had taken her hands off her life, she realized that she hadn't truly done that. You see, instead, she had an image in her mind of what a noble, heroic life would look like for God. She had in her mind what it was going to be and what her life was going to be, and that she, in many ways, hadn't given it over to God. She had simply asked God to make that happen. That she wasn't serving God, that she was using God. She knew what she needed to do. She had in her mind what she needed to do. She had even prayed years before, God, I know you are all good. I know you are all wise. I know you are all loving. But if you were truly all good and wise and loving, could it be that his plan for her life would be different than the life she imagined and was trying to get God to have her do? And it is at that moment that she gets on her knees and she prays what she calls the first time of really getting her hands off of her life and said, God, this life is yours. I trust you no matter what this life looks like. And then Gershner, who's preaching the sermon, just turns around and says, if this woman hadn't given everything over to God, what makes you think you have? And while I would ask the same question, and I think we need to get to that deep point that we need to take our hands off of our lives. That ultimately we have to say, God, this is your life. I have traded my life for yours. That's the sacrifice part. But now I'm going to live the life that you long for me in the circumstances you have for me, and that's the living part. Because she described that moment of laying down and giving over her life, she described that as a moment of freedom. It is a moment of truly being free, of being able to finally put her life in the hands of an all-knowing, all-wise, all-loving God. And maybe you're like me, you're sitting there and you sure would like to know what happened for the rest of her life. I don't know. I don't know. And that's not the first time that's happened. Jesus did that to us. Remember the story in Mark? Jesus started on his way and a man ran up to him and fell on his knees before him. Good teacher, he said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Well, why do you call me good? Jesus answered, no one is good except God alone. I mean, he goes right into this. He goes right into that. Realize our very standard of goodness is going to be God himself. But he goes on, and here's the major point I want to make. He says, you know the commandments. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony. You shall not defraud. Honor your father and mother. He does, I think, exactly what this guy's expecting. Gives him the checklist. Here's your checklist. Here's just, you've got your little checklist. Here's the things you need to do, right? Here's what it is. That you just do these things. Here's the bare minimum. He answers the call of this man's consumer heart. Because we're good consumers. We know how to be good consumers. We know how to go pick out the deals. And what do we mean by deals? We mean, how can I give as little as possible to get as much as possible? How can I'm really good at that. I'm really good at making sure and working the system and making sure I give as little of my time and talent and treasures as possible so that I can get as much in return. Return on investment. That's what I'm all about. I'm a good consumer. And he answers this guy's consumer heart. Well, okay, you want the list? Here's how much this costs. And this guy goes, teacher, I have kept all these since I was a boy. This man sounds dedicated to me. I don't want to go look at that list again because I suspect I wouldn't be able to say like he did, I did all those since I was a boy. He says he was able to, and Jesus looked at him, got furious at him. Is that what it says? He looked at him, and he loved him. He longed for so much more for this man. He loved him, and he says, one thing you lack. This one piece. Now I'm going to get to that in a second. That one thing bit. But he says, go sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come and follow me. And at this, the man's face fell. He went away sad because he had great wealth. That cost too much. No, Jesus, I was willing. When you had this other list, I was okay with it, but you're asking too much. Now, what I mean by we didn't get to hear the rest of the story, I mean, did this guy ever come back? Did this ever, what happened to the rest of his life? Did he lose all his wealth? I don't know. I'd like to know. But I don't think that's the point that Jesus is trying to get at. This one thing you lack. And I really believe that had this guy been able to give up everything he had given and went after to follow Jesus, he says he finally gave up all his wealth, that he indeed gave over total surrender to God, that what would happen is a few years down the road, Jesus would look at him again and go, there's one more thing. And there's one more thing. And you see, if all you're interested in as a consumer, if all you're interested in is giving the minimum, every time Jesus goes, oh, by the way, there's one more thing, you're going to feel betrayed. Are you kidding? I already did the stuff I was supposed to. I already prayed the prayer. That should be good enough. I already say I'm a Christian. Isn't that good enough? I go to church and I tithe and I do ministry and I go to I do all that stuff. Isn't that enough? And you're asking more? But remember that passage in view of God's mercy, of a Jesus who looks at him and loves him, who is calling him deeper, that the person who is willing to surrender, that sees the difference between who they are and who they could be, that they learn and realize that there's one more piece that they haven't given to God, will see that as a mercy. Will say, you're right. I want that too, and as hard as it's going to be, I'm going to crawl up on that altar again. Total surrender. That God wants it all. And that's going to, does it fit all? Does God really get a say in our lives? Does he get to say how I earn money? Does he get to say what I do with that money once I earn it? Does God really get a say in where I live and how I behave and whether I get an education and what my life is going to look like? Does God really get a say in all those things? Does God get a say in who I'm becoming? Does he get a say in what happens to my family? Does he get a say in what happens to my church? Oh, well, sure, the church thing, sure, that's easy. Is it? It's not easy for me. 20 years ago when I was working to become a pastor, I had a vision of exactly what the church would be. I knew exactly what it was going to look like. And you could do that. You could say, I know what the church should be, and you could go look around at all the other successful churches and say, we need to look like that. We need to be that. We need to be as big as that, or as outreaching as that, or as whatever as that one. That we have this idea of success, but could we really say, God, it's going to be what you want it to be? I don't get to determine what the heroic life looks like. I don't get to determine what the prime success is. All I get to do is to devote myself to your purposes, God, as best as I understand them. And when you come up to me and go, Bill, there's one more thing you lack. Will you walk with me, Jesus, in that process of climbing back on that altar again and saying, okay, I'll take my hands off my life. So as we always do, we'll just put it as a question. Do I dedicate my life to God's purpose? Whatever it is that God wants, whatever circumstances, I will be faithful in that moment. And as hard as it is, I will give up. I will sacrifice my dreams of what the good and holy and perfect life is, and instead be willing to say, God, whatever you want, whatever circumstances I'm in, because as hard as it is, I do believe that you are good, that you are loving, and that you are wise, wiser than I am, better than I am, more loving than I am. and I'm willing to take and go forward with you, because that's the life that is truly life.